So welcome to a new video in International Economics. We are in the second module of the paper International Economics. Uh, Second module is on trade theories. We have today limitations of absolute advantage theory. Yesterday we learned the absolute advantage theory of international trade put forward by Adam Smith, the father of modern economics. Today we have to look at the limitations or criticism raised against absolute advantage theory. Absolute advantage theory is not free from flaws. It is not free from criticisms. There are so many criticisms are raised against the absolute advantage theory. Let's look at the limitations one by one. Remind you, whenever you want to criticize a theory, you have to look at the assumptions of the theory. Assumptions are in fact the preconditions for validating the theory. Without a single assumption to get fulfilled, the theory will not be valid. Theory cannot be valid. This is not the problem of the theory. This is a fact related to theory. So let's look at the limitations, whether it is that may be unrealistic, that may be realistic. Just we want to look at the limitations of the theory. The first one I have for you is absolute advantage theory of international trade is a too simplified model, or this is highly simplified model. In fact, the trade model cannot be that simple as put forward by Adam Smith or other classicals. This is 2 into 2 into 1 model. That means trade is happening between two nations of two commodities with one factor only, produced by one factor only. So this is not a realistic assumption, as multi-nation trade is pretty common in the modern day trade, and multi-commodity trade is also common, and single factor of production is not common, as we have so many factors of product, as we have a mainly two factors of production, like including labor and capital, but capital has been completely neglected, and this is a too simplified model. Second assumption is the absolute advantage theory neglected the role of capital. Capital is a vital factor of production, in fact, in the present day trade economic situation, as capital's role is vital. Capital roles is vital for the developmental projects. So cost of capital is an unavoidable cost almost in the present day trade situation, but this has been completely neglected. Absolute advantage theory did not consider this fact. So since according to classicals, labor is the only factor of production, wage is the only cost of production according to the classicals, but this is also not true in the present day situation. Cost of capital is there, it has been neglected by the classicals. Maintenance cost is there, as depreciation is common when production process is in progress. The advertisement cost is there. We need to market our commodities in the present day situation, but this is common. This is not possible when perfect competition is in place. According to the classicals, the markets are perfectly competitive, but in fact that assumption will also be criticized. So transportation cost is also absent according to the classicals, but transportation cost is much required for international trade, as the mostly commodities will be transferred through ships. So another criticism is on labor mobility across international borders. According to the classicals, according to the absolute advantage theory in particular, labor is mobile inside the nation only. Labor is not mobile across the borders according to the classical, but in fact labor is mobile across the borders. The persons can fly from India to USA for job. And there are so many Keralites started traveling immensely to Gulf nations for seeking employment since 1970s, since the oil price hike. So this is labor mobility across the borders is not absent. labor mobility is possible in fact, but this possibility has been completely neglected by the classical theorist, especially absolute advantage theory. Whenever labor mobility is possible, what happened to the absolute advantage theory? It will affect the absolute advantage of the nations. So that is why they assumed labor is not mobile across the borders, labor is just mobile inside the borders. Another criticism is on labor homogeneity. According to the classicals, according to the absolute advantage theory, all laborers are alike in terms of productivity. Productivity of laborers are alike for all laborers in all nations according to classical, but this is not in fact a true assumption. As you know, labor may be differ in terms of productivity in one nation. So productivity of laborers may be different from one nation to another nation, one sector to another sector. So productivity may not be equal in both nations. So whenever this assumption is wrong, or when labor homogeneity, when labor is proved to be heterogeneous, or when labor is not alike in both nations, then absolute advantage will be affected by this labor heterogeneity. But that heterogeneity is not possible. Labor will be homogeneous according to classicals, but that has been severely criticized. According to classical economists, trade barriers are absent in the international trade situation, but this is also criticized severely by the economists. As you can see, the trade barriers are common in the present day situation. Even in the globalized period, you can see US-China trade war. United States has been imposing tariff on Chinese commodities, and in retaliation China has been imposing tariff on US commodities, and you can see this trade war between US and India. US has been imposing tariff on Indian commodities, and India in retaliation imposing tariff on US commodities which is being imported by India. So this trade war is in terms of tariff barriers or non-tariff barriers. This is in fact common, but this common practice has been completely neglected by the absolute advantage theory to validate their theory. If trade barriers are proved to be in place, what will happen? It will affect the absolute advantage. Trade will not happen exactly as per the absolute advantage. So this is in fact no trade barriers assumption is in fact an ideal situation, which is not possible in the present day trade scenario. So another criticism raised against absolute advantage theory is on returns to scale. According to the classical economists, there will be constant returns to scale in both nations. There will not be any kind of increasing returns to scale or diminishing returns to scale, but in fact diminishing returns to scale and increasing returns to scale are possible in the present day trade situation, as increasing returns may be possible with economies of scale. Economies of scale is possible for large scale production activities. So increasing returns has been completely the possibility of increasing returns and diminishing returns has been completely neglected by the classical economists. This is to avoid the invalidity or invalidation of the theory of absolute advantage. So when there is increasing returns to scale or diminishing returns to scale, it will affect the absolute advantage of two nations. So another criticism is on the full employment assumption of the classical economist. This is in fact another unrealistic assumption of the classical trade theory. According to the classical economists, there will not be any kind of unemployment. There will not be all laborers will be employed in both nations. but in fact there are so many people remaining unemployed, as you can see in the present day situation. So when there are some laborers remaining unemployed, it will affect the absolute advantage and production capacity of the nations. So it will the trade then will not be according to the classical theory. So last criticism I have for you is on competitive economy. Criticism on competitive economy. According to the classicals, according to the absolute advantage theory in particular, perfect competition is in place. But this is an ideal situation and almost unrealistic assumption of the classical theory according to the critics, as imperfect competition is pretty common in the present day situation. Oligopoly is there, monopoly may be there, and monopolistic competition is there, but competition in the perfect sense is in fact absent according to the critics of the theory. So when markets in both nations are not competitive or not perfectly competitive, then the absolute advantage of the nation, then trade will not happen as per the classical theory. So with that, let me brief the presentation. So in fact, international trade theory put forward by Adam Smith, absolute advantage theory, has set a basis of trade between two nations. They have set, he has set basis of gainful trade, or he explains how does the trade will happen, or why does the trade will happen between two nations. And according to the theory, in essence, nation with absolute advantage will export the commodity, nation with absolute disadvantage will import the commodity. So the advantage is in terms of cost of production. When cost of production is low, that nation has the advantage, and that nation should specialize in the export of the commodity, and other nations should import the commodity. So the theory is right when all assumptions are fulfilled. Even if a single assumption is not fulfilled, the theory cannot be valid according to the as per the theory. So the critics attack the unrealistic assumptions of the absolute advantage theory, and even though there are so many criticisms raised against the theory cannot be said as invalid, as this has set the classical theory put forward by Adam Smith has systematically set a basis of gainful trade between two nations, and this is the base on which the another important theory was set up, that is comparative advantage theory.